I saw her across the killing floor of the office, a place where voices overlapped like serrated blades and the sound of clicking heels beat out a rhythm of pure, unadulterated panic. It was an ant colony on fire, a frenzy of mid-level suits chasing deadlines like their lives depended on it. But she moved through the madness like she was walking through a cathedral at midnight. Calm, grounded, unbothered by the blood sport of corporate ladder climbing. Her name was Amara. She didn't just walk, she occupied the space around her with a quiet confidence that felt like a slap in the face to every panicked soul in the building. She looked like someone who had already stared down the barrel of a storm and didn't blink. I'm a man of precision, of cold, hard authority, a man used to being the loudest pulse in the room. But every time she crossed my field of vision, my focus didn't just slip, it shattered. At first, I told myself it was just a professional curiosity, the kind of prey feels for a target that doesn't run. Why didn't she rush? Why did she look me dead in the eye without a flicker of fear? Her silence was louder than any defiance I'd ever faced, a quiet earthquake that unsettled the very foundation of how I ran my empire. But curiosity is a gateway drug. And before I knew it, it had spiraled into a bone-deep obsession. I started manufacturing reasons to drag her into my office. Work reviews that didn't matter. Corrections on files that were already perfect. Questions I had the answers to before she even walked through the door. Every single time, I sat there and studied her like a man possessed. Her voice composed and steady. Her emotions locked behind a fortress of restraint. She never tried to impress me. She never groveled. And that was the hook that dragged me into the deep. Amara wasn't blind. She saw the prolonged stares that lasted a second too long. She felt the tension in the room, thick enough to choke on, masked behind the thin veil of my authority. She'd seen the pattern before, the shadow of power leaning too close, interest disguised as a paycheck. Then came the evening that changed everything. The office was a tomb empty of the frantic masses, with nothing but the soft, rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass. I called her in one last time. As she turned to walk out that door, I let the word hang in the air like a heavy chain. Stay, I said. The weight of it nearly cracked the floorboards. She paused, her back to me, before turning with that same unshakable stillness. This isn't about work, is it? She asked quietly. For the first time in my life, the man of 1,000 answers had absolutely nothing to say. The silence between us stretched out, a vast, dark territory filled with everything I was afraid to admit. I don't understand you, I finally admitted, my voice dropping the command, stripped down to the raw nerves beneath. You don't try to please me. You don't fear me. And yet, I can't get you out of my head. Amara took a slow, steadying breath, her eyes locking onto mine with the force of a head-on collision. I'm not a puzzle for you to solve, Mr. Sun, she said, her voice like iron wrapped in velvet. And I am damn sure not something for you to own. The sun hadn't even cleared the skyline before I was back in that glass and steel cage, tearing through her latest reports like a man looking for a confession in a stack of lies. My heart was a tripwire, and every time I saw her name on a digital header, it snapped. I didn't need the data. I didn't need the metrics. I needed the sight of her standing in that doorway, that unshakable stillness acting as the only anchor in my spiraling world. I found it, a microscopic discrepancy in a font weight, a margin that was off by a hair's breadth. It was a lie, a manufactured sin, a minor correction, designed for no other purpose than to summon her into my sanctum. I buzzed the intercom, my finger lingering on the plastic long after the signal died away. Amara. My office. Now. The wait was a slow-motion car crash. Minutes felt like hours as I sat behind that mahogany fortress, adjusting my cuffs, smoothed the tie that was already perfect, trying to regain the cold authority that used to be my second skin. Then the door opened. She didn't hurry. She didn't scurry like the rest of the ants. She walked in with that same grounded, almost holy calm, her heels hitting the floor with a deliberate, steady pulse that seemed to mock the frantic thudding in my chest. You found an error, Mr. Sun? She asked, her voice as smooth as polished stone. She stood there, her Afro-American features framed by the morning light, her presence filling the room until the air felt too thick to breathe. She didn't lean in. She didn't look for approval. She just stood, an immovable object meeting my supposedly irresistible force. I pointed at the screen, my hand steady only by a sheer act of will. The alignment on the third slide. It's sloppy. It's not our standard. She stepped closer, peering at the monitor. I could smell her then, not a perfume but something real like rain on warm earth. She didn't quail. She didn't apologize. She just turned her head and looked me directly in the eye, her quiet confidence acting like a mirror that showed me exactly how pathetic my curiosity had become. "I'll fix it," she said simply. There was no fear in her gaze, only a deep, penetrating honesty that suggested she knew exactly what game I was playing. The curiosity trap had snapped shut, but as I watched her walk away, I realized I wasn't the hunter. I was the one caught in the teeth. The office was a tomb, the frantic energy of the daylight hours buried under a shroud of blue shadows and the rhythmic, violent drumming of rain against the reinforced glass. Everyone else had long since fled, leaving behind only the cold hum of servers and the heavy electric scent of a coming storm. I sat in the darkness of my corner office, the glowing monitor casting a skeletal light over my face, watching her through the glass partitions. She was there at her desk, packing her bag with that same maddening, grounded grace, a solitary flame in a frozen world. My pulse was a hammer striking an anvil. I didn't just want to see her, I needed to break the silence that had been suffocating me for weeks. As she stood to leave, I stepped into the doorway, my silhouette cutting through the dim light like a sharp blade. "Stay," I said. The word didn't just hang in the air, it landed with the weight of a heavy chain, anchoring her to the spot. She paused, her hand frozen on her bag, before turning to meet my gaze with a stillness that felt like a physical blow to my chest. "This isn't about work, is it, Mr. Sun?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying the force of an absolute truth. The man of precision, the architect of cold authority, was gone. In his place stood a man stripped down to his raw, keen nerves. I walked toward her, my shadow stretching across the floor until it touched her feet, the sound of the rain outside becoming a deafening roar in the silence between us. "I don't understand you," I admitted, the confession tasting like iron in my mouth. "I have spent my life breaking people, making them move to my rhythm, but you don't try to please me. You don't fear the power I wield." I stepped into her space, my breath hitching as I looked into eyes that had survived storms I couldn't even imagine. "And yet, I keep thinking about you. It's not a choice anymore. It's an obsession that is tearing the floor out from under me." The admission was unsettling, a crack in the armor that I had worn for a lifetime. For a moment, the imbalance of power vanished, leaving only two souls trapped in the rain-slicked darkness of a midnight office. I saw the exact moment the realization hit her, that I wasn't just her boss anymore, but a man drowning in a stillness I could never hope to own. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick as smoke and heavy as lead, pressing against the glass while the rain outside turned into a ragged, relentless assault. I stood there, stripped of my titles and my cold authority, waiting for her to wince, to look away, to give me some sign that the power I'd spent a lifetime building still meant something in the space between us. Instead, Amara just exhaled, a slow, steady release of breath that sounded like a soldier settling into a trench before the final charge. "I am not a puzzle for you to figure out, Mr. Sun," she said, her voice dropping like a hammer onto an anvil, striking with a resonance that vibrated in my very marrow. She didn't move back, she didn't give an inch of the territory she occupied. "And I am damn sure not something for you to own." The words hit me harder than any physical blow I'd ever taken in a boardroom or a back alley. It was a surgical strike to the ego, a realization that cracked the porcelain mask of my own making. For a moment, I wasn't the man who owned 40% of the district. I was a shadow in my own office, haunting a woman who refused to be haunted back. I saw the chance I thought I was taking, the voracious curiosity I'd dressed up as interest, for exactly what it was, a boundary I had already violated in the dark corners of my own mind. "I'm not looking for a master, and I'm not looking to be a trophy," she continued, her quiet confidence acting like a serrated blade cutting through the atmosphere of my obsession. She looked me dead in the eye, her gaze a mirror reflecting the cutting, desperate parts of myself I'd tried to hide behind a tailored suit and a Maserati's roar. I had no prepared answer, no clever negotiation to bring to the table. I was reeling, the floor falling out from under me as the weight of her stillness finally crushed the last of my arrogance. As she turned to walk away this time, I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I just stood there in the shadows of the empty office, listening to the rain and the fading echo of heels that didn't need to rush for anyone, especially not for me. The days that followed were a cold, calculated war of attrition, played out in the sterile light of a corporate arena. I stopped calling her into my office. I stopped inventing the minor corrections and the false emergencies that had become my lifeline. The curiosity trap had been dismantled, leaving nothing but a ragged, hollow silence where my obsession used to roar. The office returned to its frantic, bloodsport rhythm, but for me the pulse was gone. I sat behind my mahogany fortress, watching her through the glass partitions like a man observing a miracle from the far side of a canyon. She moved with that same unshakable stillness, her heels hitting the floor with a steady, grounding pulse that no longer had to dodge my predacious gaze. I had stopped watching her so openly, but every fiber of my being was still tuned to her frequency, a silent radio receiving a signal I was no longer allowed to broadcast. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been inverted. My cold authority felt like a cheap costume, a suit of armor that was 3 sizes too small for the man I was becoming. I saw her in the break room, her posture calm and unbothered, while the rest of the hive buzzed with the usual desperate urgency. She didn't look for me. She didn't check the doorway to see if my shadow was looming. She was free, and in her freedom I found my own cage. The silence between us was no longer thick with what was unsaid. It was a hard, physical boundary, a DMZ that I had built with my own arrogance. I retreated into my work, burying myself in metrics and precision, trying to find the man I used to be before her stillness cracked the floorboards of my world. But the clarity was starting to seep in through the fissures. I wasn't just a boss anymore, and she wasn't just an employee. We were 2 ships passing in a midnight storm, the rhythm of the office carrying us toward a confrontation that I could feel coming in the marrow of my bones. The rhythm of the office was a relentless machine, a grinding of gears that usually offered no mercy, but the silence between us had become a different kind of weapon. I was a man of cold authority, sitting behind my glass walls, watching her move through the frenzy with that same unshakable stillness. But the clarity I had been searching for didn't come from a spreadsheet or a board meeting. It came one morning when she walked into my office without being summoned, her heels hitting the floor with a steady, deliberate pulse that sounded like a countdown. I looked up, my focus slipping as it always did when she was near. She didn't sit down. She didn't wait for my lead. She just stood there, grounded and calm, looking me in the eye without a flicker of fear. "I'm transferring departments," she said. The words landed like a quiet earthquake, a subterranean shift that tore the floor out from under my empire. It wasn't an outburst or a negotiation. It was an absolute truth delivered with the force of a head-on collision. "Why?" I asked, though the answer was already tasting like iron in my mouth. My voice was lower now, stripped of the command that had defined my life. She met my gaze with a devastating honesty. "Because I deserve to feel safe where I work." The blow was surgical, cutting through the extreme curiosity I had dressed up as interest. I had spent weeks creating minor corrections and reasons to force her into my presence. But in that moment, I realized I had only succeeded in becoming the storm she had to survive. By choosing her own safety over the role I had used to trap her, she was taking back every inch of territory I had tried to invade in her mind. I had no prepared answer. I sat there, the man who supposedly owned everything, realizing I owned nothing in the face of her self-respect. It wasn't just the loss of an employee, it was a realization that cracked the foundation of who I was. As she turned and walked away, leaving my office for the last time as my subordinate, the stillness she left behind was deafening. The quiet earthquake was over, but the landscape of my world had been permanently, violently reshaped. The stillness she left in my office was more violent than any riot, a deafening vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of my lungs. I stood there, the king of a glass empire, realizing my crown was made of nothing but rough shards and broken promises. I had called it taking a chance, a hunter's euphemism for a hunt I dressed up in a tailored suit. But as the echo of her heels faded, the clarity hit me like a head-on collision at midnight. I looked at my hands, the hands that had built this fortress of cold authority, and saw them for what they were, claws that had tried to grasp something holy and only succeeded in bruising it. My curiosity hadn't been a search for understanding, it had been an invasion. Every unnecessary meeting, every manufactured correction, every prolonged stare, it wasn't a romantic pursuit. It was a boundary I had crossed 1,000 times in my mind before I ever opened my mouth. The office felt like a tomb now, the frenzy outside just a hollow noise that meant nothing. I had spent my life believing that power meant access, that being the loudest pulse in the room gave me the right to rhythm of everyone else's heart. Amara hadn't just moved departments, she had moved beyond the reach of my arrogance. She had looked me in the eye without fear and told me I wasn't something to fear, I was something to be safe from. The weight of that realization cracked the floorboards of my soul. I wasn't losing an employee, I was losing the man I thought I was, and God help me, he deserved to die. In the wreckage of my ego, I finally saw the truth. You don't own stillness. You don't figure out a woman who has already survived the storms you're just starting to feel. This wasn't about loss. It was about the brutal, bloody clarity of realizing I had become the very thing she needed to survive. I sat in the darkness, the rain still drumming like a funeral march, beginning the long, slow work of dismantling the prey to find the man. I sat in the silence of my corner office, a kingdom of glass and chrome that felt more like a mausoleum with every passing hour. Outside, the city was a sprawling, neon-lit beast, but in here, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of expensive scotch and the ghost of a stillness I'd tried to break. I looked at my reflection in the window, the sharp jawline, the eyes that people said were made of ice, the cold authority that had been my armor and my brand for a decade. It was a shadow I had cast so long and so wide that I could no longer see the man standing at the center of it. The frenzy of the office continued below, a blood sport of ambition where my name was whispered with a mixture of respect and a bone-deep fear I had once thrived on. But the taste of that fear had turned to ash in my mouth. I found myself standing at the edge of the killing floor, watching the clicking heels and the overlapping voices, and for the first time I didn't want to command them. I wanted to burn it all down. I was craving a change that felt like a sharp blade in my gut, a desperate need to rip off this tailored charcoal suit and see if there was a heart still beating underneath the precision. I had built an empire on the idea that I was the loudest pulse in the room, but Amara had shown me that real power was the ability to stay grounded while the storm was tearing the world apart. I tried to summon the old ruthlessness, the voracious curiosity that used to define me, but the fire was gone, replaced by a hollow ache of realization. I was a prisoner of my own reputation, a man who had become a caricature of power while she was free. I looked at the desk where she used to sit, the space she had occupied with such unshakable dignity, and realized that my cold authority was just a mask for a man who didn't know how to be human. I had spent a lifetime crossing boundaries, but the only one that mattered now was the one I had to cross within myself to prove I could be better than the prey I'd become. The shadow of my power was finally starting to shrink, and in the growing light of that loss, I began to see the brutal, bloody clarity of my own need to transform. The elevator doors slid shut like a guillotine, severing my connection to the glass mausoleum on the top floor and the shadow of the man who had haunted it. Stepping into the new department wasn't just a change of scenery, it was like coming up for air after drowning in a pressure cooker of cold authority and predacious curiosity. Here, the air didn't vibrate with the electric hum of an obsession I never asked for. The overlap of voices was just business, and the clicking of heels wasn't a frantic sprint to escape a gaze that turned attention into a weapon. Amara reclaimed her space with a stillness that was no longer defensive. My new desk was bathed in the neutral, honest light of a team that saw me as a colleague, not a puzzle to be solved or a trophy to be owned. There were no minor corrections manufactured to drag me into a sanctum of unsaid weight, and no commands to stay that felt like heavy chains. The departmental divide was a physical and psychological DMZ, a hard-won territory where my quiet confidence was finally allowed to just exist without being an affront to someone's ego. For the first time in months, the office rhythm didn't feel like a blood sport. I moved through the day with a grounded, unbothered grace that was finally met with professional peace rather than unsettled obsession. I had survived the storm that no one else could see, and in the aftermath, I had chosen my own safety over the chance a powerful man thought he could take. As the rain tapped softly against the windows of this new floor, it wasn't a soundtrack for a confrontation, it was just rain. I had forced the shift from loss to clarity, and in this sanctuary of my own making, I was finally safe to do the work I was meant to do, standing on ground that I had leveled myself. The imbalance was gone, buried under 14 floors of steel and a refusal to be anything other than exactly who I am. I stood in the corridor, a shadow haunting the borders of a world I no longer controlled. The air on this floor didn't taste like the pressurized oxygen of the executive suite. It tasted like work, like sweat, like the unfiltered reality of people who didn't need a title to know who they were. I leaned against the cold industrial stone of the doorframe, my shadow stretching long and rough across the linoleum, a dark stain on the sanctuary she'd built for herself. My ego was a dying beast, clawing at the inside of my ribs, screaming for the cold authority that used to be my armor. I felt the urge to straighten my tie, to fix a cuff, to summon the voracious mask that made men wince and women groover. But every time I looked through the glass and saw her, the impulse withered into ash. She was there, hunched over a terminal, that unshakable stillness radiating from her like a heat signature. She moved with a grounded, unbothered grace that made my empire look like a house of cards. I was a man of precision, yet here I was unannounced, uninvited, and utterly without a plan. I had spent a lifetime crossing boundaries, but the threshold of this department felt like a physical barrier, a DMZ I had no right to breach. My heart was a hammer striking a cracked anvil, a rhythmic thudding that seemed to echo in the hollow space where my arrogance used to live. I'd come to apologize. I'd come to prove I could be better than the man who'd spent weeks constructing a curiosity trap. But standing there in the shadows, watching her thrive in a space where I was nothing but a memory of a storm, I felt the brutal, bloody clarity of my own insignificance. I was a prisoner of the shadow of power, struggling to breathe in a world where stay was no longer a command I could give. I gripped the edge of the doorway until the stone bit into my palm, my knuckles white against the charcoal of my suit, wondering if I had the strength to walk in as a man instead of a boss, or if the beast I'd spent 33 years feeding was all that was left of me. The threshold of her new department felt like a wall of fire, a physical barrier designed to keep out men exactly like the one I had spent 33 years becoming. I stood there, stripped of my executive armor, the charcoal wool of my suit suddenly feeling like a shroud rather than a uniform of power. My heart was a rough stone in my chest, rhythmic and heavy as I watched her look up from her work. She didn't quail. She didn't scurry. She just sat there in her quiet stillness, her eyes meeting mine with the force of a head-on collision that didn't need to scream to be heard. I stepped into the room and the air shifted. The cold authority I'd wielded as a weapon for a decade had vanished, leaving behind only the raw, exposed nerves of a man who had finally realized he was drowning in his own arrogance. I didn't summon her. I didn't command her. I simply walked until the distance between us was short enough for the truth to be the only thing left. I was wrong, I said. The words were short, brutal, and tasted like iron in my mouth. They were the hardest words I had ever spoken, delivered without the shield of my command or the buffer of my bank account. I saw the flash of surprise in her eyes, a momentary ripple in the grounded calm she carried like a shield. I wasn't the king of the hill anymore. I was just a man standing in a workspace that didn't belong to him, offering a confession to a woman who owed me nothing. About you. About the meetings. About the way I looked at you like you were something to be solved. I continued, my voice low and stripped of its usual razor-edged precision. I treated my obsession like a right and I treated your boundaries like a challenge. I was wrong about everything. I stood there, waiting for the sky to fall or for her to call security, but the silence that followed wasn't heavy with the weight of my power. It was open. It was honest. I had dismantled the curiosity trap and offered her the wreckage. I looked at Amara, really looked at her, and realized that for the first time, I wasn't seeing a stubborn girl to be broken, but a person who deserved to exist in a space that wasn't haunted by the shadow of my ego. I had crossed the most important boundary of all, the one that separated the beast from the human being. And in the stillness of that moment, the blood sport of my old life felt like a shadow story I was finally ready to stop telling. The silence that followed my confession didn't have the rough edge of a corporate execution. It was a vast, open territory, a DMZ where the only things left standing were two people and the wreckage of my ego. Amara sat there, her presence an unshakable anchor in the shifting tides of the room, her eyes searching mine with a precision that cut deeper than any boardroom interrogation. She wasn't looking for a retreat or a grovel. She was looking for the truth beneath the charcoal suit and the cold authority I'd worn like a shroud. You were wrong, she repeated, her voice like low thunder, steady and absolute. She stood up, moving with that same grounded, unbothered grace that had first sent my world into a tailspin, and walked until the air between us was thin enough to ignite. But an apology is just words, Mr. Sun. It's a transaction. And you've spent your life believing everything, every favor, every person, is something you can buy or negotiate into submission. I felt the old wolf stir in my gut, the part of me that wanted to argue, to justify, to reassert the power I had spent a lifetime building. But I looked at her, really looked at her, and the fire died in my throat. I saw the stillness that had survived storms I couldn't even fathom, and I realized I was standing in the presence of a strength that didn't need a title to exist. I'm not interested in your regret, she continued, her gaze a mirror reflecting the roughly broken man I was terrified to become. People love to talk about fate or how the world changed them. But that's a coward's excuse. People can change, Mr. Sun. But they only do it if they choose to. They only do it when the pain of staying the same is worse than the fear of the unknown. She paused, the weight of her challenge hanging in the air like a heavy chain. Are you apologizing because you lost your chance, or are you choosing to be a man who doesn't need to take one? The question was a surgical strike to my soul. I looked at the floorboards, then back at her, the cold authority finally crumbling into ash. I was a man of precision, a man of cold, hard facts, but the only fact that mattered now was the one she just laid bare. I am choosing to, I replied, the words raw and stripped of their command, a vow made in the quiet sanctuary of her new world. The blood sport was over. The choice was mine. The silence in the department had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of an impending storm or the rough glass of a boundary under siege. It was open. It was thin. For the first time in that high-octane graveyard of corporate ambition, the air between us didn't hum with the electric charge of a wolf's gaze or the static of a woman's survival instincts. I stood there, my hands no longer white-knuckled and my charcoal suit no longer a shield of cold authority, just looking at her. Amara leaned back against her desk, her posture a testament to a stillness that had finally found its peace. The frantic clicking of heels and overlapping voices of the office felt like a distant memory, a faint noise from another world that could no longer touch us. We were just two souls standing in the quiet light, the imbalance of power buried under the weight of the truths we'd finally had the guts to speak. "There's no command coming, Mr. Sun," she said, her voice a low, steady current that pulled me back from the ledge of my own ego. No meetings to manufacture. No corrections to fix. Just the air. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the last of the pressure evacuate my lungs. I didn't need to figure her out, or own the space she occupied. I just needed to be there. The obsession that had nearly burned the floorboards out from under me had been replaced by something quieter, something more dangerous than control because it required me to be human. "The air is fine," I replied, the words raw and stripped of their razor-edged precision. I wasn't the man who owned the building anymore. I was just a man who had realized he'd been breathing underwater for 33 years and was finally tasting oxygen. She watched me, her quiet confidence no longer a mirror reflecting my flaws, but a bridge. There was no fear in her eyes, and for the first time, there was no shadow of my power leaning too close. We were standing on level ground, a hard-won DMZ where the only thing at stake was the honesty of the moment. "It's different when you don't have to fight for it, isn't it?" she asked, a small, knowing glint in her gaze. "It's everything," I admitted. The blood sport was over. The hunt had ended, and in its place was a stillness we had both chosen. We stood there in the quiet of the new department, the pressure gone, the control dismantled, just two people watching the rain tap against the glass, waiting to see what would grow from the ground we had finally leveled together. The department was winding down, the frantic overlap of office noise fading into the low, steady hum of the city breathing against the glass. I stood there, watching her pack her things with that same unshakable grace, but the air was different now. The electric charge of my obsession had been bled out, replaced by a silence that didn't feel like a weapon. I was a man who had spent 33 years believing that to be effective, I had to be a wolf, a shark in a suit of charcoal armor. But looking at her now, I felt the rough edges of that armor finally starting to rust and fall away. I didn't move toward her with the hunting precision of the man I used to be. I didn't loom. I didn't cast a shadow of power that tried to drown her stillness. I just stood there, my hands loose at my sides, my pulse no longer a hammer hitting an anvil. I was just a man who had made a choice to be human, and the weight of that choice was the most honest thing I'd ever felt. Amara looked up, and for the first time she didn't have to brace herself against the storm. Her eyes, those eyes that had seen things I could only imagine, searched mine with a terrifying, surgical clarity. She was looking for the shadow of the king of the hill, the man who'd used authority to buy access to her boundaries. But she found something else. She found the softened intensity, a fire that was still burning, but no longer looking to consume everything in its path. The intensity was still there. You don't just erase 33 years of being a man who takes what he wants, but it had been reshaped, tempered in the blood and fire of a true realization. It was a humility that didn't taste like defeat, but like a beginning. "You're still here," she said, her voice a low, steady current that pulled me back from the ledge of my own uncertainty. "I'm choosing to be," I replied, the words raw and stripped of their razor-edged command. She studied me for a long, heavy moment, the silence between us thin and honest. Then, unexpectedly, the corners of her mouth lifted. It wasn't a professional mask for a client or a polite gesture of compliance. It was a smile, real, unpressured, and radiant. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, a sunrise over a territory I'd finally stopped trying to conquer. "Good," she whispered. That one word, backed by that one smile, hit harder than any defiance I'd ever faced. It wasn't a victory for me, it was a victory for us. The imbalance was dead. The blood sport was over. And in the quiet of that afternoon, standing on equal ground, I finally understood what it meant to be seen without being hunted. The rain had stopped, leaving the city windows streaked with silver and the air tasting of wet pavement and a hard-won peace. I stood by the elevator bank, the charcoal weight of my jacket over one arm, no longer a shield or a shroud. The frenzy of the office continued above us, a distant, hollow thrumming of people still caught in the blood sport of their own making. But down here, the rhythm had finally settled into something human. Amara walked toward me, her heels hitting the floor with that same unshakable, grounded pulse. But this time it wasn't a march of survival, it was a choice. There was no pressure in the air, no electric hum of a wolf's gaze, and no shadow of power leaning too close. For the first time in 33 years, the ground under my feet didn't feel like a ledge I was about to fall from. It felt like bedrock. "You're late," she said, her voice a low, steady current that carried no edge of judgment, only the honesty of a woman who had seen the storm and decided she didn't need to fear it anymore. "I'm learning," I replied, the words raw and stripped of the razor-edged precision that used to be my only currency. I wasn't the man who owned the building anymore. I wasn't the king of the hill, looking for a trophy to prove I existed. I was just a man standing in the quiet light, looking at a woman who had taught me that real power wasn't something you took, it was something you shared. The imbalance was dead, buried under the wreckage of the curiosity trap, and the ego I'd spent a lifetime feeding. We stood there, two people starting over in the thin, honest air of a world we had leveled together. I looked into her eyes and saw a stillness that no longer had to act as a fortress. It was an invitation. "Where to?" I asked. "Wherever we choose," she whispered. She smiled then, and it wasn't the defensive shield I'd first encountered. It was a sunrise over a territory that had never been mine to conquer, but was now mine to walk beside. I didn't reach for her with the voracious grip of a man used to getting exactly what he wanted. I just held out my hand, palm open, a silent vow made in the stillness of a new beginning. She took it. Her grip was firm, grounded, and real. In that simple, unpressured connection, I felt the roots of something deeper than obsession finally take hold. The hunt was over. The blood sport was a shadow story. We stepped out of the building and into the city, two equals walking into the dark, ready to see what would grow from the ground we had finally found together.